It's Wednesday, May the 29th, 2024, and this is the Daily Article Podcast. I'm Chris Elkins with the Denison Forum, narrating today's article written by Denison Forum co-founder and CEO, Dr. Jim Denison. The prosecution and the defense ended their closing arguments late last night in Donald J. Trump's trial in New York City. A verdict could be reached as soon as today. Both sides of the partisan aisle see the trial as a referendum on democracy in crisis. Mr. Trump's opponents view him as an autocratic threat to the future of American self-governance. His defenders see him as the victim of quote-unquote lawfare waged by his political opponents and the person best able to lead our nation in a chaotic world. But those on both sides who fear for the future of our democracy at least presumably believe it should have a future. By contrast, a rising cohort rejects the very premises upon which America was founded. The threat was made clearer and more compelling by a recent article I want to discuss with you today. Peggy Noonan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning opinion columnist for the Wall Street Journal, author of 9 books, and former special assistant and speechwriter for President Ronald Reagan. She has been a fellow at Harvard University's Institute of Politics and has taught history at Yale. Her Memorial Day column titled, "Teach Your Children to Love America," was so significant that I hope you'll read it in its entirety. Here's the part I want to consider today. Quote, "We live in an age, I'll say this quickly as we all know it, in which children are instructed in 100 different ways through 100 different portals that America is and always was a dark and scheming place, that its history is the history of pushing people around, often in an amoral quest for wealth, but also because we aren't very nice. And we never meant it about the Declaration. Ideology and idiocy impose this view. Shallowness, too. It began some decades ago, but has speeded up and become more extreme in the past 10 years. End quotes. She is talking about a revisionist view of American history made popular by critical theory historian Howard Zinn and many in our elite universities. They claim that America was founded as a colonizing oppressor of indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. In their view, our founders were primarily interested in preserving and advancing their personal and financial interests, so the quote-unquote democracy they created was never intended to serve all the people, just those in power. As critical theorists have it, the solution, borrowed from Marxism, is for the oppressed to oppress the oppressors. In recent years, this has included violent riots to protest racial inequality, street theft as reparations for the victims of such inequality, and anti-Semitic campus demonstrations to disrupt the establishment and protest Jewish Zionist quote-unquote crimes. This false narrative is poisoning the very present and threatening the future of our nation. As commentator Andrew Sullivan notes, the claim that America is an eternal white supremacist nation will sap you of your optimism, self-confidence, direction, and self-esteem, end quote. As a consequence of this false vision of America, he points to a huge increase in depression, anxiety, and mental illness among the young. By contrast, Sullivan writes, "Believing you have agency to change your life, what I always took to be a defining character of American democracy, gives you direction and energy. It allows you to see beyond your own self-pity toward helping others. It helps you moderate the ups and downs of life. It gives you a sense of control over your destiny, things you can do to improve your life." End quote. Abraham Lincoln faced the greatest crisis in American history, yet he remains similarly convinced, quote, "Intelligence, patriotism, Christianity, and a firm reliance on him who has never forsaken this favored land are still competent to adjust, in the best way, all our present difficulty," end quote. However, a century ago, President Calvin Coolidge identified the very problem we now face. Quote, "The foundation of our society and our government rests so much on the teachings of the Bible that it would be difficult to support them if faith in these teachings would cease to be practically universal in our country." End quote. Now that these foundational teachings are ceasing to be universal in our country, or even acceptable to many, the society and government they support are foundering. Consequently, we urgently need to heed Mr. Lincoln's prophetic warning. America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves." End quote. Here's the challenge. You and I must resist the temptation to reject those who reject us. Jesus is continuing his earthly ministry through us today. We are the conduit through which his Spirit moves, the bridge over which his transforming grace walks into the lives we influence. Accordingly, we must love our neighbor so deeply that we'll do whatever it takes, according to Mark 12, verses 30 and 31, to help our neighbor love our Lord. Loving America means loving Americans. It means praying for the Spirit to love through us, as noted in Ephesians 5:18 and Galatians 5:22, and then heeding Matthew 5:44, loving others even and especially when they do not love us. Our calling continues today, according to Luke 10:37, with the next need we can meet with the mercy of God. Peggy Noonan closes her column with this urgent plea. Parents, help your children love this country. It will be good for them, and more to the point, this country deserves it. And when you do not love something, you lose it. We don't want that to happen. End quote. Do we? We're grateful for our podcast listeners. If you find the Daily Article podcast helps you better understand today's news and cultural issues and then respond biblically, please rate and review the Daily Article podcast on the platform from which you subscribe. That helps people find and follow the Daily Article podcast.